What happens when the president of a nation sees a street child and doesn't just walk past? In the heart of Ouagadougou, under the unforgiving African sun, a barefoot boy selling bottled water caught the attention of one of the most powerful men on the continent, Ibrahy Trari, the president of Bokhina Fasho. What followed wasn't just a touching moment, it was a spark that lit a national fire. A single conversation on a dusty roadside gave birth to a movement that defied global expectations, challenged foreign interests, and restored dignity to an entire generation. This is not just a story about politics. It's about pain, power, and purpose. It's about a leader who chose to kneel instead of stand tall, a boy who carried more than water, a nation that decided to lift itself, not wait to be saved. In this video, we'll follow the real-life undercover president, a man who saw beyond reports and statistics to the soul of a nation. A story filled with quiet tears, bold reforms, and a ripple effect that's shaking the world from dusty villages to international summits. Watch until the end, because what happened next shocked even his greatest critics, including one, former US president. If you care about leadership, dignity, or the untold stories of Africa, this one's for you. It was supposed to be just another ordinary afternoon in Ouagadougou, the kind where the sun scorches the streets and people move quickly between shadows to escape the heat. But that day, something quietly extraordinary happened. President Ibrahy Trari, dressed in plain clothes and walking without his guards, had decided to take a moment for himself. No cameras, no speeches, just a silent stroll through the pulse of the capital city he leads. Why would a sitting president walk alone through the crowded streets of a bustling African market? Maybe he needed to feel the heartbeat of his people up close. Maybe he needed to remind himself what he was fighting for. Whatever the reason, what he found would shake his heart, and soon, the world. There, between honking cars and shouting vendors, was a little boy, no more than 8 years old, barefoot, sunburnt, and weaving through the traffic with a box of bottled water strapped to his chest. His name was Issa, and his smile, though timid, was determined. He wasn't just selling water, he was surviving. President Traoré stopped, transfixed. This wasn't just another child hustling in the heat. There was something in Issa's eyes, hope, fatigue, and a kind of resilience that only life's harshest tests could forge. It was the kind of look that can stop a nation's leader in his tracks. He could have kept walking, could have handed over a few coins and moved on, but he didn't. He bent down, looked the boy in the eyes, and asked a simple question. How much for one bottle? That moment, humble, human, and unexpected, would spark a movement that would redefine what it means to lead with dignity, and this is how it all began. Issa didn't look like someone the president would remember. To the crowd, he was just another kid darting through the traffic, calling out to uninterested strangers, clutching his plastic box of water bottles like it held all the hope he had left. But to President Traoré, this boy was unforgettable. When Traoré asked the price, Issa looked up, eyes wide with surprise. 100 francs, sir, he said softly, holding out a cold bottle with both hands, as if offering something more precious than water. The president smiled gently, reaching into his pocket. I'll take 2. Issa handed him the bottles, his fingers trembling slightly, not out of fear, but fatigue. He thanked him quietly and turned to leave, eager to catch the next customer. But Traoré stayed where he was, watching the boy move back into the chaos of the market, weaving around motorbikes and dodging elbows, still trying to sell. Most people didn't even see him. Some turned away. Some waved him off. But still, Issa smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile children wear when they've grown up too fast. The kind that says, I'm okay, even when they're not. President Traoré felt something shift inside him. He'd read reports about street children. He'd heard presentations, seen statistics, signed policies, but nothing had prepared him for this. One small boy under the blazing sun, working not for toys or treats, but for survival. He knew in that moment that he couldn't just walk away. This boy had a story. And Traoré wanted to hear it, not as a politician checking boxes, but as a man who for just a few minutes wanted to see the world through a child's eyes. So he called the boy back. "Issa," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Come here a moment." Issa hesitated for a moment when the stranger, whom he still didn't recognize as the president, called him back. He glanced around, unsure if he was in trouble or had done something wrong. But something in the man's tone felt different. It wasn't harsh, it was kind. He shuffled back, still holding tightly to his water box like it was a shield. "Yes, sir?" he whispered. "You're tired, aren't you?" Traoré asked gently, now crouched to meet him eye to eye. Issa nodded. Not with self-pity, but with honesty. "Yes, sir, but I need to help my mother." Traoré felt a sharp pull in his chest. It was one thing to read about children who sacrifice everything for their families. It was another to hear it from a child's mouth. "Where is your mother now?" he asked softly. "At home," Issa said, lowering his eyes. "She's sick and can't work, so I come here every day to buy food and medicine." There was no complaint in his voice, no bitterness, just quiet responsibility. A boy forced into adulthood far too soon. Traoré placed a steady hand on Issa's small shoulder. "Have you ever dreamed of being something else? Something more than a water seller?" Issa blinked, as if the question itself was unfamiliar. Then he whispered, "I wanted to be a teacher." He paused. "But now I just want to help my mum." That simple sentence cut deeper than any political speech ever could. A child giving up his dreams for survival. But Traoré wasn't ready to. Let that be the end of Issa's story. "You don't have to choose," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We can find a way to help your mother and still let you dream." Issa looked up, confused but curious, and that was all the president needed. Curiosity meant there was still hope. For a long moment, the president said nothing. He just looked at the boy, his small fingers gripping the cracked plastic handle of his box, his clothes clinging to his skinny frame, his eyes filled with more strength than any child should ever have to carry. President Ibrahy Trari knew this moment demanded more than sympathy. It demanded action. "We're going to start right now," he said, voice steady and low. "First, we'll take you and your mother to the hospital. She needs care and you shouldn't be carrying this weight alone." Issa blinked in disbelief. "But who will pay for it?" he asked, voice barely audible. Traoré offered a small smile. "I will," he said simply. "But this isn't about me. It's about you. You and your mother deserve dignity. You deserve respect. And you deserve the chance to dream again." For the first time that day, Issa's tough exterior cracked. Tears welled up in his eyes, not from fear or exhaustion, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being seen, of being heard, of being cared for. He dropped his gaze, whispering, "Thank you, sir." The president leaned in and gave the boy a brief protective hug, a silent promise that this was only the beginning. With a discreet signal, one of the presidential vehicles approached. Traoré opened the door and gently guided Issa in, telling him they were going to take him home, and to something better. As they drove away from the crowded market, Traoré sat quietly beside Issa, reflecting on how one unexpected meeting could shake the very core of leadership. This wasn't charity. This was responsibility. And from this day forward, he knew he had to turn Issa's personal struggle into a national mission, because for every Issa, there were thousands more, and none of them should be invisible any longer. By the time President Traoré returned to the presidential palace, the sun was setting, but his mind was wide awake. The dusty streets of Ouagadougou still clung to his thoughts. The sound of car horns, the scent of roasted peanuts, the image of Issa's small hands offering cold water to survive another day. He didn't sit down. He didn't rest. Instead, he called an emergency meeting with his closest advisors. "What we saw today," he told them, "isn't a one-time tragedy. It's our daily reality." Marie, his trusted advisor on social development, leaned forward. "Mr. President," she said, "if we act now, we can create something permanent. A program not just for Issa, but for all children like him. Education, healthcare, family support, everything they need to break the cycle." Traoré nodded. We'll name it Future with Dignity. And Issa, he will be the face of it. Not because he's special, but because he represents the strength and sacrifice of every forgotten child. Within hours, plans were in motion. Emergency funding was approved. Community workers were dispatched to begin identifying children in street labor. Doctors were assigned to homes where illness had forced kids to grow up too fast. Social programs were activated, not just as government policy but as a moral mission. And then something incredible happened. Word of Issa's story began to spread. Local newspapers picked it up first. Then came radio shows. Social media exploded with photos of the president walking hand in hand with the barefoot boy. Hashtags like Dignity for All and You Are My Child trended across the country. People didn't just watch, they responded. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up. For the first time in a long time, hope wasn't just spoken about in speeches, it was being lived. And it had all started with one boy, one question, and one man who chose to listen. The story of the barefoot water seller and the president who stopped to listen captured the imagination of an entire country, but no one expected how quickly it would capture the world. Within days, images of President Traore kneeling beside Issa flooded the internet. It wasn't staged, it wasn't polished, it was real, and that raw humanity resonated deeply. People didn't just share the story, they felt it. Videos of the quiet exchange under the sun were reposted with captions like "This is what leadership looks like" and "Dignity begins with empathy." Hashtags like "Issa is my child" and "Lead with heart" and "Future with dignity" trended not only in Bokhina Fasho but across West Africa. Influencers and local artists created drawings, songs and poems about Issa. One child's tears had sparked a cultural wave. But perhaps most powerful was how ordinary citizens responded. In marketplaces and village centers, people began organizing food drives for families like Issa's. Local teachers volunteered to tutor children after hours. Medical students set up street clinics to check on kids selling goods. What started as a government program had turned into a people's movement. In a national press conference, President Traore spoke directly from the heart. His voice trembled as he said, "I've always known that children like Issa exist, but seeing him, hearing him, it made something shift inside me. Leadership is not about power, it's about proximity, it's about care." The crowd watching didn't just applaud, they stood. Across the country, something intangible was beginning to grow. Unity. The kind born not from orders or laws, but from shared purpose, from compassion. And in the midst of it all, Issa, now, safely at home, his mother receiving medical treatment, was just beginning to understand the weight of what his quiet courage had ignited. He wasn't just a boy who sold water anymore. He had become the face of a nation's heart. As Issa and his mother received care in a local hospital, something bigger than either of them began to take root across Bokhina Fasho. What started as a spontaneous act of empathy was now becoming structured change. President Traore wasted no time. He officially launched the Future with Dignity initiative, a sweeping national plan designed to reach the country's most vulnerable families. The program wasn't just about school books or hospital beds. It was about restoring the humanity that poverty had taken away. Teams were dispatched to urban slums and rural villages. Social workers identified children who were out of school. Health officials tracked families without access to care. Communities were encouraged to nominate children they saw working in the streets, ensuring that no one slipped through the cracks. And at the center of it all, Issa's story was used not as a symbol of pity, but of power. At one school, President Traore visited a new classroom where Issa sat in the front row, pencil in hand, notebook open, wide-eyed with possibility. "You don't have to sell water anymore," Traore told him gently. "Now, your only job is to learn, to dream, and to become whatever you want." Issa nodded, holding up his notebook like it was the most valuable thing he'd ever owned. "I promise I'll try hard, Mr. President," he said quietly, and that was enough. But the program didn't stop with Issa. In towns across the country, children who once begged or hustled in the streets now had uniforms, backpacks, and futures. Some learned to read for the first time. Others simply learned to play again, to be children as they were always meant to be. What President Traoré had started was no longer just a policy. It was a promise that no child should have, to choose between survival and a future. And this time the whole country was holding him to it. Months after Future with Dignity took shape, its impact began to echo far beyond the streets of Ouagadougou. In a small rural village in northern Bokhina Fasho, President Traoré made another unannounced visit. This time, he was greeted not by crowds, but by a quiet classroom filled with children, and one young woman who stood at the front of the room like a lighthouse. Her name was Fatou. She was a teacher, calm, focused, and commanding the attention of dozens of curious young minds. But what struck Traoré most wasn't just her presence, it was her past. Fatou had once been one of them, a street child, a sister, a daughter of a family too poor to send her to school. But years earlier, during the first waves of community education support, Fatou had received a scholarship, basic supplies, and a single message: "You matter." Now she was paying it forward. "Mr. President," she said, holding up her student list with pride, "because of your program, I was able to return to school, graduate, and come back here to teach." Traoré was silent, his eyes glistening. Fatou smiled softly and added, "I don't just teach math or reading, sir. I teach hope." That single sentence traveled faster than any speech he could have given. Photos of Fatou and her students circulated online, showing a blackboard with 3 simple words: "Future with Dignity." And for many watching, this was the moment they realized the program wasn't just changing children, it was growing leaders. Across Burkina Faso, young people like Fatou began to step up. Some taught, others volunteered at clinics. Many became mentors to the next wave of students entering school for the first time. Traoré's vision had moved from paperwork to people, from policy to purpose. Because when children grow up believing they are seen, they don't just survive, they lead. As Future with Dignity blossomed across Burkina Faso, transforming lives and restoring futures, not everyone was celebrating. Behind closed doors in foreign boardrooms, murmurs of dissatisfaction began to grow louder. Some international investors, particularly those used to exploiting cheap labor and land, were uncomfortable with the shift. Traoré's policies emphasized self-reliance and rejected dependency on foreign aid tied to control. He was encouraging local farming, land ownership by villagers, and sustainable development without selling off national resources. At a global investment summit, one European businessman scoffed. "This program is disrupting the investment climate," he claimed. "They're pushing away capital, technology, opportunity." But President Traoré was unbothered. On a visit to a community-run farm in Koudougou, he addressed the concern head-on, standing before farmers who now grew crops on land once monopolized by outsiders. "Development," he said, "does not mean surrendering our soul. It does not mean giving up our land, our dignity, or our dreams. True progress comes when the people build it with their own hands." The farmers applauded, not because they were told to, but because they finally felt ownership of their future. Yet the pushback didn't stop there. In the United States, news outlets reported that former President Donald Trump was monitoring the situation. During a private conversation leaked to the press, Trump reportedly fumed, "This guy's getting too popular. He's showing the world that Africa doesn't need saving. That's dangerous." To Traoré, that criticism was confirmation. He wasn't trying to be liked. He was trying to be heard. He knew that leading his country towards self-respect and independence would make some uncomfortable, but he also knew that real change often begins where comfort ends, because this wasn't just about politics. It was about principle. Burkina Faso wasn't asking for charity. It was claiming its future on its own terms. The air buzzed with excitement. From distant villages and crowded towns, people traveled for hours to gather in the heart of Burkina Faso for one event, a national celebration of the future with Dignity program's first major milestones. Farmers, Students, teachers, doctors, and children stood side by side beneath fluttering flags. There were no suits and red carpets, just pride. A real worn-in, dirt-on-your-shoes kind of pride. President Traoré took the stage dressed not in Western formal wear, but in traditional Bokhina fabric, hand-woven by local artisans. The crowd erupted in applause, not just for him, but for what he now represented, a leader who didn't just talk of dignity, but lived it. He looked across the sea of faces, young and old, hopeful and hardened, and his voice cracked with emotion. "We're not here to count achievements," he began. "We're here to honor the people who make those numbers real. The mothers who carried water before carrying their children to school. The fathers who planted seeds not just for food, but for a future." Among the crowd stood Marie, the program's tireless social architect. Nearby, a young boy named Malik, once treated at a rural clinic thanks to the reforms, clutched a photo board filled with snapshots of repaired classrooms, newly dug wells, and smiling students. And then there was Fatou. She had traveled all the way from Bobo Dioulasso, her mother's worn suitcase in hand and tears in her eyes. When she stepped onto the stage, she carried something precious, a weathered book once owned by her late mother. Inside, a handwritten note read, "Knowledge is the greatest gift we leave behind." She handed the book to Traoré. "This is why we fight," she said. He took it with both hands, held it high, and the crowd erupted, not for a policy but for a shared purpose. In that moment, Bokhina Fasho wasn't just celebrating a program. It was celebrating a people who had found their voice. When the cameras fade and the applause quiets, what's left? A boy who no longer walks the streets, a mother who no longer suffers in silence, a teacher who carries her mother's dreams in an old notebook, and a president who reminded the world that leadership isn't about power, it's about people. This story isn't fiction, it's not a movie, it happened, and it's still happening. But let's be clear, it shouldn't take a president to stop and ask a child his name for change. To begin, it shouldn't take a viral photo or a tearful speech for us to notice what's happening around us. The world doesn't need more saviors, it needs more listeners, more dignity, more action. Ibrahy Trari didn't rescue Issa, he recognized him, and in doing so, he saw thousands more. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it, talk about it. Let it be known that in a world full of headlines, this quiet revolution deserves to be heard, because someday someone will ask, where were you when the winds of change began in Bokhina Fasho? Let your answer be, I watched, I listened, I believed. If you believe dignity is a right, not a privilege, leave a comment. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to hear more stories like this, because the next Issa is out there, and maybe the next leader too.